Let's talk about democracy. There's a famous quote that democracy is the worst possible form of government, except for all the others. It's attributed to Winston Churchill. Let's talk about that, because what we've seen in the United States is that there's a caveat that you have to add to that sentence, which is that democracy only works if the government runs on taxes, not debt. It can be obviously a combination of both, but once you shift from a government that needs taxes from the people in order to function, and you move away from that system that links the voter with the politician, especially in a country that has 3 different levels of government, local, state, and federal. Once you move away from that system into a system that is driven by debt, it has the tendency to sever the link between the voter, aka the individual, and the politicians, and shift that relationship to the banking system, as well as the insurance system. Because remember, a banking system is basically a financial system that's underpinned by insurance, risk management, so to speak. Now, you can see that, growing up, right, I was in a position where I remember George Bush, the senior, saying famously, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And I didn't realize at the time, but remember that the President of the United States does not make tax policy. It's Congress that makes tax policy. So the President was, despite having 3 separate branches of government, this President was purporting to speak on behalf of the legislature that he expected to control. And it turns out that the President was not able to make good on that promise. There were some taxes that were enacted during his term. So, again, you've got a system where we used to run on taxes, or at least the idea that government would run on taxes. And we've moved away from that. Well, we know that now because we have bonds that are being issued at negative interest rates in order to maintain this debt-soaked system. But Amazon is another example of what has changed. Amazon was in a position where it was not making any money. It was not making a net profit because it was investing in research and development. And it went from selling books to becoming essentially a technology company. And even today, it has perhaps the most secure, relatively secure system, data system in place, because even the Department of Defense in the United States uses its services, or used its services. So in the case of Amazon, it was taking on a lot of debt initially, not making any money, and reinvesting everything into the business. The change in model has therefore occurred on both the government sector and the private sector. And that has had consequences for everyone involved all over the world. Let's talk about what those consequences have been. On an individual level, Donald Trump, who won the election in 2016, is, of course, a man propped up by debt, especially from Deutsche Bank, and especially through the legal system, where he was able to discharge a lot of debt through selective bankruptcies for a few of his casinos / hotels. And then he moved away, apparently, from that into a system where he became essentially a licensor, where he would give his name to a building or a hotel / casino combination in exchange for a cut of the profits and so on and so forth. I'm sure that the terms were quite lucrative, I'm sure. But again, all of that is really based on a system in place that seeks to makes debt the engineer, or the engine, as well as perhaps the engineer of society. And you can see that the problem with debt is that not only does it place a banker over the individual voter, but it severs the link between integrity and government. And we know that on a local level, on an individual level, if we're in debt, we care more about paying off that debt than anything else. Almost anything else, I'd say. And it's the same thing with government, except that the government can take out so much debt that it, at some point, doesn't really want to pay it off. It just wants to maintain the cash flow and the interest payments on that debt in a way that allows it to roll over the debt. Because the government, unlike Amazon, cannot or should not be seeking to become a market leader in a way that eliminates competition. And so, a couple of things. So Amazon has been successful because it was able to establish pole position, a leading position, based on developing a technological standard that everyone basically has to use. Because technology is inherently, all of the standards are inherently insecure and therefore require substantial money, substantial revenue to defend. And if you're the best among, just a relatively poor bunch, you're still going to get almost all the dollars because there's no other choice. And that's what's happened in America for the most part, right? We now have technological standards that are controlled essentially by only a few companies: Apple, Google, Amazon. And the reason for that is, again, because of the ability to wipe out the competition based on, in this case, you could argue it's merit. They've got the most secure standard out there. You can see that what works for technology does not work for government, because the point of government is not to establish a position that essentially eliminates all the competition using debt. The point of the government is quite different. It's to maintain essentially respect for the individual in order to maximize prosperity for all citizens as well as future citizens. In other words, a fancy way of saying everybody possible within reason, but certainly anyone who lives within your borders, regardless of citizenship status. Because, if you don't treat people well within your borders, you're not going to get a lot of immigrants coming in. And as we all know, talent is not equally distributed all over the world. And so just like natural resources, talent is something that most empires and most successful countries attempt to steal from each other. So the first lesson here in the new economy or economic structure is that the quest for a secure technological standard has made debt the handmaiden of government, and therefore severed the link between the individual taxpayer and his or her politician. I'm reminded of something somebody once told me, that when he was having a problem, I'm not sure if it was with a retail operation or a government operation, he complained that I pay my taxes. That was his response to receiving poor service. You can see why that notion is now quaint and how it defeats integrity, in a sense, by removing accountability both ways. So, in other words, if the government employee is no longer really dependent on you, but an image in order to satisfy the banking system to continue to get more debt, and it doesn't have to be the banking system. It could be just, a local government that is aligned with a national government that happens to be the same party. So as long as you're in their good graces, you end up in a position where the individual becomes smaller on the whole than the banking system. And in this case, when you meld debt with politics, suddenly the banking system becomes, your politicians become, in some cases, without massive integrity, agents of not citizens, but of bankers, and therefore insurance companies. So the first lesson is all systems, whether democratic or otherwise, require integrity to survive. So we've never been looking for a system that's been perfect. We've only been looking for a system that's been able to maximize integrity and potential. And this is the second lesson with debt, is that number one, it causes inflation, because when you take out debt, when prices go up, right, the real value, or I should say cost, of taking out that loan in real terms decreases if prices go up. So if I've got a house and I take out a loan for $200,000 to buy that house, and it pops up within 10 years to $400,000, you know, in other words, that $200,000 isn't only leverage. It's a situation where I've essentially, you know, created I guess we could call it the time value of money. But bottom line is that typically in inflation, you know, $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow. So in other words, you know, I could take out $200,000 and make that into $400,000, but it becomes more difficult to take out $400,000 to make it into $800,000, probably, right? Because wages typically don't accelerate at the same pace as within a debt-based system as under a tax-based system. That's one of the reasons, right? But the other, besides inflation and time value of money, there's also this idea that debt subordinates other values that are necessary for a functioning governmental system, namely integrity. And so when we're looking for a system that maximizes service and integrity and progress and prosperity, a system where debt takes priority as the engine over some sort of other link that's more direct between the individual and the government, will always, at some point, if not managed properly, will always create a system where people without integrity are able to rise up within the government. And one of the reasons for that is because if you have debt, you can, again, wipe out your competition. You know, well, there's obviously there are laws against this, right? There's laws against being a loss, you know, having a loss leaders. There's antitrust laws as well. And I always joke that, you know, the government brought a case against Bill Gates and Microsoft, you know, that it really should have brought against Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg. And it wasn't really able. It was just in a position where it was, you know, it had the right lawsuit at the wrong time and against the wrong company. Because Microsoft has actually been a fairly good corporate citizen, especially in terms of disability access. And there's no comparison between Nadella, the CEO, and Zuckerberg. Nadella is a fine human being by all accounts, as well as a fine executive. And so the second lesson again is that debt subordinates most other values, especially integrity, and also has the potential or the tendency to promote people not based on merit, not based on discipline, but simply based on who has access to the best bankers and the best lawyers. That, of course, explains in part Donald Trump. I'm not saying at all that Hillary Clinton, who was competing against him in 2016, had more integrity, or I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that she was more competent. I'm simply saying that there are probably many people in the United States who would be more competent than both of those individuals. And yet they're not in that position. Why? It's a good question. So when we're looking for a system that promotes prosperity and sustainability, integrity has to be a part of it. And as we've moved away from a tax-based governance model into a debt-based governance model, you can see how society necessarily changes. You can see why technology companies now have, and CEOs like Jeff Bezos of Amazon, now have more credibility than government actors and essentially government executives. And that goes back to what we talked about before, where it's not necessarily a bad thing to take on debt to create a more stable or the most stable technological standard, thereby not necessarily, in the process, wiping out competition based on a natural monopoly. It's not necessarily a bad thing because it indicates not integrity, but competence as best as possible within an imperfect system, because all technological standards are imperfect. But in government, you can see how that's a problem. And with Amazon, of course, once you establish a platform, everyone else has to go through you. So suddenly Amazon becomes not just a bookseller, it becomes a portal for everything, including movies and content. And so when you look at it, and when you try to compare what's happened over time, you cannot separate debt and technology and their impact on politics all over the world. When I say all over the world, what am I saying? Look at China. Why has China been so successful in elevating an incredible number of people out of poverty and into the middle class? Part of the reason is because the government never relinquished control over the idea of a technological standard. And it was able to defend it. And as a result, it was able to maintain relevance. That's not a coincidence. And I said before that you don't necessarily want a debt-driven government, whereas a debt-driven technological standard, to the extent it produces one that is more secure than all the others, might be not such a bad thing. Now, it turns out that China is a net creditor. It has debt, but it's a creditor. It's got more assets vis-a-vis the United States, compared to the United States. So between the United States and China, we have a system where the United States, on a net basis, owes money to China. If you had to liquidate all liabilities today, the United States would end up, well, setting aside the massive economic disruption, it would still be a situation where China would not be in debt at the end of the day to the United States. So we have a system in place where the Chinese have taken the best of all possible worlds, as far as we know so far. They've maintained a technological standard. They've defended it, which is massively expensive. And at the same time, they haven't rendered themselves hostage to an international banking system that was made by the West under Western laws and Western standards post-World War II. And that, in a nutshell, is responsible for China's success. Now, the other issue in terms of debt is that we always talk about competition, right? And the government, of course, because it has the power to print money, has the power to wipe out competition against itself. Not just through laws, tariffs and so on. And that's one of the reasons why so many people within my lifetime have wanted options, have lost faith in the government. And one of the reasons is because the government became, in my lifetime, at least on a state and local level, beholden to the banking system over individual voters, but also at the same time created a system where the costs of competing with the government became prohibitive for the individual. And as a result, the individual is now caught in between a private sector and a public sector, neither of which really needs the individual or even the voter anymore to survive. The banking sector, of course, has an interest in maintaining a secure technological standard. It doesn't matter what your ideas are. If you're not able to protect money in someone's bank account in order to loan that money in a way that's reputable and honorable and profitable, you can have all the ideas you want, but it's not going to work. And so what makes the United States banking system so much better over, since World War II is not only the fact that after World War II, the United States was a net creditor, even amongst its allies, but also the fact that it was able to defend a technological standard that was the most secure for quite a number of decades. And in doing so, attracted talent, people, and financial stability, which of course led to a more stable society. And that's another reason why once you have a government that relinquishes control over a technological standard and therefore a portal into other activities, it's in a sense extinguishing itself, its relevance in society, unless it's able to regulate those companies in a way that makes sense and in a way that defends the individual. Thus far, that's not been the case. I had an issue with Amazon where my product reviews were just wiped out without any sort of explanation. I wrote to a state government agency, consumer agency, telling them, listen, I've got a few bad reviews on this website. By wiping it out, you're creating, suddenly a company goes from having 5 stars, 4 stars to maybe 4.5, or the algorithm changes based on removing a negative review that is honest. And in doing so, essentially commits a fraud on the public. And that's the interest of the consumer agency in resolving this case, because you want to have a system that is, to some extent, transparent, but also transparent in a way that gives consumers all available input, not just positive input. And the consumer agency in California wrote me back and said, we can't take individual cases, and we've written to Amazon, and they have your complaint, and there's, basically, at the end of the day, there's nothing we can do. Find a lawyer. Well, the problem with that, of course, is that there's no damages. And if I try to claim negligence, well, there's no attorney's fees. It's kind of a common law cause of action, right? It's not a statutory issue. And, what are the damages, right? I'm not out of pocket. It's really a public interest issue, but government agencies have moved away from protecting the individual into trying to create, I guess, the basis for a broad spectrum of laws. I'm not sure, quite frankly, what the government is trying to do, but they've moved on to something called impact litigation, where they're trying to aggregate a lot of claims and then, based on those claims, move forward and then try to mold corporate behavior based on the kind of claims that they are receiving. And you can see how that would make sense in a country with limited resources, but you can also see how that would denigrate the individual who's already being denigrated within the political system, as well as the economic system. So one of the problems we have in this debt-based system is that the individual ceases at some point to be relevant as the government tries to signal an environment that is suitable for investing or for receiving more loans or tax revenue grants from some other aligned government sector, government party, so on and so forth. So you can see how censorship can happen as well. This was one of the complaints of the Soviet Union, that people on a local level didn't want to antagonize people on the government agencies on a national level, because if they did, there would be consequences. Whether that was funding or some other sorts of consequences, we don't know. But this idea was always that we want to show the national government a happy face so that we can maintain our jobs. On some level, that system, which was a quote-unquote communist system, is now similar to the system we have today. Just in a massively different way, but incredibly similar. It's just indirect rather than direct. I'm trying to cover a lot of issues. The other issue is that when you have these issues that degrade the individual, the other problem is that choices become choices only in theory. So one of the problems with a debt-driven system is that if there may be private options available, in other words, in my lifetime, the government has lost credibility because it's shifted into a debt-based system, and that's caused people to go towards the private sector or favor the private sector because the private sector, you know, still needs the cash flow, it still needs to deliver. And especially in a debt-based system where suddenly, you know, once you control the technological standard, you want to get as many people on it in order to gather all the data possible so that you can move into other areas of business and take a cut from all those areas of business. You can see again how the private sector has an interest in getting you on their standard and not losing you. If only to ward off competition. Whereas the government, again, you know, as long as it keeps prices low, so in other words, as long as the price of a stamp is still quite low compared to spending, you know, $50, you know, to mail something from a private postal service like FedEx or UPS, you can see how the government can always argue, well, you know, we can't compete with the private sector because they charge a lot more. So we're going to be slower, but we'll get the job done eventually. Even that, of course, has issues today. You know, in other words, that's the easy example, the Postal Service, which, by the way, is massively in debt. And, you know, you've got a system where essentially it runs on debt, on national funding. It's not something that's sustainable, self-sustaining. But you can see how it's hard to complain about the Postal Service when, you know, if I want to mail something, you know, I can go to the Postal Service and mail it for $4 with verification. Whereas if I want the same service from a private agency, I would have to pay at least 10 times more, probably. So you can see how, on the one hand, there is a choice, but on the other hand, it's not a true choice because the price gap is quite big. The more obvious example, in other words, it's not accessible. So in other words, it's not just that you want private sector competition. You want private sector competition that makes services subject to competition in a way that's accessible. The most obvious example of this inefficiency is education. You know, I went to a pretty terrible high school. My parents, of course, couldn't pay for me to go to a private high school. And so, you know, as a result, even if there is private sector competition, it doesn't do us any good. We're still stuck with fairly terrible middle school and a so-so high school. The athletic programs were fantastic. Not so much the academic programs. And so, again, even if there is private sector competition, you can see the value. Well, first of all, you can see the problems. You can see the issue where even if a choice exists, as Chris Rock famously said, prices are the new discrimination. In other words, even if choices exist, if you're still locked out of those choices because of the high cost, they might as well not exist because they're inaccessible. And that's really one of the problems we have now is not only are we in a system that's fragmented, but we're in a system where, for the most part, we don't really have a choice in many, many areas that are necessary, unless you go in debt. Think about housing, right? That's a debt-based model. Think about cars. Think about education. All these essential services are essentially running on debt to the extent that you want choices. And once again, if you're in debt, and you're trying to come up with a system, a debt-based system is not really the most accessible system, not only because of inflation, but because it tends to promote something other than integrity. you can see how, you know, in my life, right, I've tried to look for people who have integrity. And I can tell you right now, that's the hardest thing in the world. Because I can tell you also that there's probably an overlap between the very few number of people who have integrity and how much debt they have. And so when I say that debt tends to subordinate all other values, what I'm really saying is that a debt-based governance model will almost always lack integrity, because all systems are imperfect. And because all systems are imperfect and subject to human nature, they're all going to be subject to this idea that even the best regulators are not going to be able to fix a problem where human beings are looking for the easy way out. And that, of course, gives people, especially those seeking power, leverage, literally and figuratively, over everyone else. While at the same time, given the system that we have now, minimizing true choice. And we talk about education. Remember that if you don't really have any choice, because the cost of a comparable competitor is not really accessible, unless you want to go massively in debt, and therefore, on some level, lose potentially your integrity, you can see that the government also has a complaint, because now it's arguing that if I'm going to lose a lot of my best people to the private sector, I'm also in a position where I'm subject to a system that's is trying to make me work that is biased against me, because it's trying to make me work against this other system that in most cases also receives a tax exemption, but now is attracting people who are either more affluent or more ambitious. And so there's not really any competition, again, or at least not fair competition. And the counter argument to that would be, well, you know, you are the government, you can try to regulate in a way that makes sense, so that if you give, say, a voucher, so that somebody can take that voucher and go and have an option, you can argue that you can create restrictions on those vouchers in a way that levels the playing field, whether it's forcing schools that accept vouchers to guarantee admission, you know, for the entire term, regardless of grades. You can do all kinds of sorts of regulations that make sense. But what you can't do is create options and then take your hands off the wheel. And unfortunately, that is, in some sense, what the government in this country has done. And in doing so, lost credibility.